2 Corinthians chapter 12, encouraging in weakness. Well, encouraging in weakness. Well, surely our commentator Guthrie is wrong this time, right? Yet, Paul continues to encourage his readers in weakness here, chapter 12. Presumably, this weakness that Paul now encounters is a pretty good thing for Paul's present body, even though his body got stung pretty badly at this point, or at that time, as a result of an encounter with the Messiah. His body got stung with a painful, permanent thorn. Oh, remember that one? Oh, yeah. The thorn. Remember that one from Galatians? We'll be bringing that up again. So, got stung with a painful thorn for seeing Jesus. So much for that paradise vision, huh? Yeah. Hardly wishful thinking, hardly a figment of his imagination, since no one in his right mind would fabricate something so painful. However, it appears that Paul eventually came to be resigned to that painful thorn. Yeah, resigned to it, since it was a glorious reminder of that heavenly vision that accompanied it. And a painful reminder, although it was a painful reminder, of 4 glorious visions or more. Yeah. So, what sort of a masochist is Paul anyways, huh? Oh, he just like pain? Is he really big into pain or what? Is he liking all those other beatings that he received as well? Well, I don't think so. He actually avoided a lot of that pain in the past. And he avoided the pain in the future as well, as you might read in Acts 20, Acts 22. So it was not really that he was into that thorn either. So, and not only that, but he repeatedly asked God to take that thorn away on at least 3 separate occasions. 3 separate occasions, so there must have been 4 encounters. Verse 8, we read of him asking God to take that thorn away 3 times. But, however, God didn't think that was in Paul's best interest, and God didn't think that was in his best interest either. So, instead, it seems that pain was a pretty good motivator for Paul. It got him closer to God, and it got him preaching with greater passion. And pain can be a pretty good motivator for us as well if it encourages us to double down in our walk with the Lord, in our passion for the Lord. Since there are rewards involved for that passion. So, remember from Corinthians 3, rewards, right? So, I don't think Paul is regretting that temporal pain at present. Rather, I expect his rewards will be at least doubled as a result. Yep. And doubling things in eternity is mighty, mighty big doubling. It's eternity times 2. Or eternity squared, or something like that. It's kind of huge. So, now there are some commentators who think that Paul is merely talking about, this is a friend's vision, or the alleged vision of one of those false apostles that Paul's talking about. No. Paul is just being modest here in his manner of speaking. Paul is first and foremost wanting you to consider the glorious vision rather than the visionary himself. He is wanting you to consider this as being the words of God rather than the words of Paul. And he is wanting this to be a confirmation of God's grace being sufficient for you. Do you remember Galatians? God's grace is sufficient for you. Unlike the Roman Catholic faith where it is not sufficient for you. and of God strangely empowering the weak, which is what God does. So Paul remains in boast mode here, saying he was definitely weakened and extremely humbled by this crazy thorn. Perhaps a thorn in his side, maybe a thorn in his side, just as Jesus had a spear in his side, if you might recall. We'll get into that next year with John. And that would be a pretty good reminder of Jesus. And that would be consistent with Paul saying, the Lord stood at my side and gave me strength. So that through me the message might be fully proclaimed, and all the Gentiles might hear it. That's from 2 Timothy 4:17. And that would be a pretty swell memory of a pretty good Friday as well, when Paul's sins were paid for in full. And Paul had plenty of good sins to remember as well, like coveting and murder, right? Now, plenty of sins to remember over a pretty long time, at least 14 years of remembering at this point in time, at this point of writing. At least 14 years of huge humility since his last encounter with Christ. With Paul's bizarre encounters, must have been bizarre encounters with the Lord happening on the Damascus Road. Damascus Road. Well, that's somewhere around here. Somewhere above Jerusalem. Damascus. Up on the way to Damascus. And then, at some unknown place afterwards, this is where I get to speculate. Few people speculate on this. There are a couple of people who speculate and they think, well, maybe Paul had that encounter somewhere around home, his hometown of Tarsus up here. So, however, I think it was in Arabia, down here, right down there. Some special stuff happened down in Arabia. A place where I think Paul took a holiday, a sabbatical, a holiday, just prior to his preaching in the northern provinces of Cilicia, that's his province, and northern province of Syria. And Paul took a sabbatical to that wilderness of sin. This is called the wilderness of sin, around here. I think in order to understand his Old Testament somewhat better, to retrace that wilderness experience of his ancestors a little more vividly. Kind of like the way Christians go to the Holy Land to experience their faith with a little deeper meaning, or a little deeper conference with their conscience. Likely meeting Jesus in Mount Sinai. What's so special about Mount Sinai here? Well, that's where the Ten Commandments had been delivered to Moses. I think Paul was curious about that. Meeting him as to one born in a different time, we read. Since Jesus had ascended to heaven a long time ago, years previous to that. Meeting Jesus several times over the course of that sabbatical and likely receiving confirmation from Jesus on numerous items there, including circumcision. But mostly the nature of the true gospel. The gospel of grace. That those super apostles in Corinth, way over here, were trashing. They were trashing it by imposing circumcision on Gentiles. And then after 3 years of preaching the gospel of grace around his hometown of Tarsus, right there, he submitted to that revelation of Jesus to the council in Jerusalem. He told that to James, Peter, and John in private. We read that in Galatians 2. Whereupon the gospel that was previously entrusted to Paul in those bizarre encounters was then confirmed by those pillars of the faith. Right? James, Peter, and John. They confirmed at that point that circumcision was completely unnecessary among numerous other things. And very soon after that encouraging submission, Paul then was commissioned by them via Barnabas to preach that gospel of grace in the city of Antioch, up here, where they were first called Christians. And Paul preached there for about a year with Barnabas. And then something happened while they were there. There was a collection, we read. We read there was a collection in Acts 13. Huh? A collection in Antioch? But we're reading about a collection happening in Corinth and out in Macedonia. So what's this about a collection in Antioch? Yes. 14 years before, we read that there was a collection in Antioch. And then they brought this collection down to Jerusalem, just like they did with Corinth. Now, this final letter to Corinthians is thought to have been written around 56 AD. And so this bizarre encounter with Jesus must have been experienced around 42 AD, if you subtract 14 years, since Paul says it was 14 years previously in this chapter 12. And that's a date that seems to be awfully clear to Paul for some strange reason, when Jesus undoubtedly said, "Go," to Paul. To go and preach his word, which Paul immediately returned home to do. Which is a date that also corresponds pretty well with Paul now returning to Jerusalem some 14 years later with another collection. And it seems Paul and Barnabas had brought that, as I mentioned, that collection to Jerusalem 14 years prior. And I expect that at that time, that 14 years prior, that he decided, okay, I'm in this area anyways. I'm tripping down here to check out my Old Testament faith, going to the mountain where the Ten Commandments were delivered. And that, at that time, that was a time when a certain famine was striking Rome in the year 42. They were smitten by a huge famine. And it wasn't too much later that a famine struck Jerusalem. So that collection came in pretty handy. And it spared them a good bit of grief. So now, 14 years later, Paul was returning to Jerusalem with Barnabas and Titus in tow. He's going back to Jerusalem, likely returning after a pit stop in... No, we're not seeing... I got a different map for that. Stopping in Philippi along the way because he had to escape a little bit of pain because they wanted to kill him out in Corinth. So he had to make a bit of a detour there. He was escaping a little pain. And so he returned to Jerusalem in 56 AD, just before Pentecost. What is Pentecost? Where does it say Pentecost there? Well, it doesn't really. In Acts 20, it talks about something else, a different feast, the Feast of Weeks. It's where they had a wheat harvest. They celebrated the harvest of the wheat for weeks, and they ate tons of wheat. So, what does that mean? Well, if he was all excited about going to this wheat harvest, it means he probably didn't have a wheat allergy. So this pain in his side probably wasn't a gluten thing. No. Probably not a wheat sensitivity at all. And I think it's unlikely that the thorn of Paul's was an eye issue either. I don't think that was the case either. Others say that maybe it was migraine headaches. I don't think that was the case either. Some people say it was clinical depression. I don't think so. Some people say it was his weakness was sexual temptation. I don't think so. Those are many of the silly suggestions that are made by alleged experts. But those ideas simply don't stand up to rigorous analysis. So when in doubt, go with the physical, the literal translation. Go with the literal translation and not some figurative long shot. So it felt like an actual thorn, something in his flesh, as Calvin suggests. In is an operative word here. Sort of like gallstones, perhaps, although that would have been on the right side. I expect the thorn in Jesus' side was in the left side. So likely not gallstones, but it may have felt like gallstones, or it may have felt like a pinched nerve. Well, that kind of goes away. But it was probably, not always does it. Except it was neither. But let's not pass this thorn off as simply, well, we cannot know it, so it's not worth considering. Instead, it is helpful to examine that thorn more closely to eradicate the more ridiculous claims that others say. Since we might be harassed by a similar thorn in our future. Now, this was a thorn that harassed Paul frequently, like a demon, like a messenger of Satan, he says in verse 7. But that doesn't mean that Paul was possessed by demons. No, it merely means that he was harassed. And that thorn appears to have backed off at times. In certain times of humility is suggested in verse 7. Of times of a closer walking with the Lord, where there was no room for conceit, and where any distraction of a thorn would have been counterproductive to this interaction with the Lord. So that thorn was a pretty good motivator of Paul and a pretty good restraint device as well. It made him humble. Sort of like a proper conscience in a sociopath, yet considerably more painful than a mere conscience, apparently. More painful than that. This was a thorn that gave Paul an even better reason to humbly boast about his weakness, about God's power resting on him as a result of that physical weakness. Verse 9. Yeah. And that's a power that reduced his weakness considerably. So, he moves then from unprovable weakness to provable weaknesses and provable events that prove Christ. He moves from weaker excuses to stronger excuses. That's the way most arguments go in the Bible. They move from the weakest argument to the strongest argument. And he refers to insults, hardships, persecutions, and difficulties. And he put up all of that in order to present the true gospel. Sure, he also had the marks of a true apostle, he says. Sure, he had the ability to do powerful signs and wonders, just like Peter did. Yep. But those marks should not sway those Christians in Corinth in the least, he is saying. Those false apostles that he's talking about could likely pull off similar tricks, just like Pharaoh's magicians pulled off similar tricks in Exodus. So Paul mockingly encourages them to more closely examine their trickery, the trickery that he pulled off while he was with them. After all, Paul was a pretty crafty fellow, huh? He mockingly says, I'm pretty crafty, huh? So crafty that he never even got paid for it. Never even got paid by them. And that's awfully crafty, isn't it? Crafty tricks, like not only giving those Corinthians his time, but also his possessions. Well, that's pretty crafty too, isn't it? Like a parent giving his very best to his children, apparently. Pretty crafty of your parents, isn't it? Again, not just giving them a few moments or a few candies, but essentially everything, according to verse 15. What? What? Are you out of your mind, Paul? Are those Corinthians that important to you? What, did you plan on retiring in Corinth or what? Well, these are people with a super serious discord, you were saying. They had a super serious jealousy. They had a super serious rage and selfishness. They were people that slandered and gossiped about anyone and everyone. And these people they were hyper arrogant and extremely disordered, we read in verse 20. Some of who have still not repented. People who are still indulging in sin and debauchery. And you're still doing all this stuff for them? Whoa. You must be out of your mind, Paul. That, or you must love them a whole lot more than they deserve. And that seems to be the case with us as well. Christ loves us far more than we deserve, loves us even though we are pathetic sinners. He's still giving his best to us. That we might believe in him, that we might obey him, that we might abide with him, that we might rest with him. Yeah, Christ must be out of his mind too. Huh? Thank you for being out of your mind, Father, for sending Christ to die for such pathetic sinners as us. May we abide in you, rest in you. Amen.
So thank you for your patience.